and officially start this webinar. Hello and welcome to everyone. I'm going to mute you for a moment. Don't take it personally. We will unmute you later. I am Rivera's son. I'm going to be conducting or facilitating, presenting this webinar. But before we get started, I'm going to hand it over to Nina, who is the host of these webinars through a Dutch organization called SWAG and her own project, which is part of SWAG called ToNoWo, which is Towards a Nonviolent World. And she'll give you an introduction to what is going on with these webinars and the organizations, and then we'll go from there. We'll do a technological overview so that we all know the system, and then we'll get into the actual webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Rivera. Welcome everyone. I'm really excited about this first webinar, and I saw in the chat that you are really from all over the world, and it's really exciting to be here all together and learn more about nonviolence, which is one of my passions. So the speaker of today is Rivera. She has written different books, one of which also she will talk about in the webinar, the Dandelion Insurrection.
Nina, your internet is freezing a little bit, so maybe repeat that. Yeah.
So I'm sorry for if I may have some problems with the internet, because I think it's not so stable. I won't talk so long, so hopefully we will get through this. I was saying about the third webinar, which will be about one of Rivera's books, The Dandelion Insurrection, which is a very exciting story about the US in the future and how people organize themselves to bring more democracy, in the simple version. So Rivera is not only a writer but also an activist, and has a radio program, the Love and Revolution Radio, and she's also the co-initiator of Live, Share, Grow, the movement of the 100%. Maybe you want to talk a bit more about that. And she's the media coordinator of Contain Nonviolence and Patje Edene, and has attended a
So Nina just got a little bit unstable in her internet, but hopefully she will pop back on with us. I want to share a link with you while we're waiting for Nina, which is that if you're looking for the registration for the other webinars, I'm going to put that link in the chat box. These are free webinars, so you can sign up for them anytime. And the next one is going to be on nonviolent responses to hate, discrimination, and xenophobia. We're going to do this one as a discussion, a structured dialogue. So we hope you will join us and come with the solutions that are happening in your area to these problems. We know both in the US and in Europe it is an issue of concern. So I'll present a little bit about what's going on in the US, which is not making the news radar. And then we'll open up a discussion about what we all know together, and then where we could be going together with a little creativity. The second webinar after this is the Dandelion Insurrection, and then the third webinar will be on solutions to nonviolent responses to dealing with climate change and environmental destruction. So please do join us for those as well. What Nina was also going to mention is that These webinars are presented to you all and anyone who's interested in joining as a collaboration between the Dutch organizations and then also the US-based Campaign Nonviolence, which is an organization that I work with. And Campaign Nonviolence seeks to build a culture of active nonviolence. We do have people organizing throughout the world as well, but a lot of our work is based in the United States. Many of us who are in the US tend to be very US-centric. So one of our intentions, Nina and I, is to actually take a chance to bring together people from in the US and outside the US to connect together. And now that Nina's back online, maybe Nina, you want to say just another brief word about that part of the intention of these webinars.
Yeah, sorry for this technical difficulties. So I'm not sure everything you said because I lost out on the part. But I just wanted to say something about the organization that's hosting this. So it's called the Foundation for Active Nonviolence, based in the Netherlands, and it started in to oppose the military draft. And from there, they started to develop different nonviolence trainings, which actually nonviolence trainings for youth workers in Europe. And I'm still hoping you can hear me.
Yes, you're still good right now.
Yes. Yeah. Because yes, it sometimes seems like it's freezing a little bit. Yes, so this is the background, and we wanted to facilitate these webinars. Exactly what we was just saying, facilitate the exchange with activists from all over the world, because often we are perhaps a little bit focused on our own countries. And I think in this way there can be a lot of synergy and cross-fertilization. So I hope I didn't forget anything. I want to give the word back to you, Rivera.
Thank you, Nina. That was great. The one thing we should mention just at this point is that we thank everyone who is able to and wants to make a donation to continue to support this work. I'm going to put the link to the donate page into the chat box. If you can support these webinars, it helps us continue to do more future webinars. So we do thank you for that in advance. So let's see. One of the things that I would like to start with is just an orientation to the system, because I know that not everyone is familiar with the system. So first of all, I want to show you how to get your speaker in a big box on your screen, or conversely to see everyone's faces. So if you move your mouse up to the top right hand side of the screen, you will see a little box that pops up that says either, depending on where you are, Gallery View or Speaker View. If you click on that box, it will switch you back and forth. So you will either see in Gallery View the thumbnails of all the people on the call, or in Speaker View, you will see whoever is speaking as a large box. Typically that will be me today, although you will probably hear from Nina, or you may also hear from the participants who are asking questions. If you go into Gallery View, you will see that we have a lot of people on this call. If you want to see who is on this call, And you need to move your mouse to about midway down the screen on the right-hand side or the left-hand side, and you will see an arrow that shows the pages of little thumbnails of people who are on this call. If you click on that, it will switch the pages of the screen so that you can see who is here. As I've been saying, on the bottom left of your screen is your mute button. I'm going to keep you mostly on mute for now. When we get to the Q&A section of today's workshop webinar, we'll change that arrangement so that you can toggle yourself on and off, but cutting out the background noise is very helpful for the rest of us on the call. Right next to your mute button is a stop video button. If you are having trouble hearing me, one thing that might help is turning off your video so that the bandwidth of your computer internet connection is sent just to the audio. So that is an option. Moving down this bottom bar at the bottom of your screen, you will see a box that says Participants. If you click on that box, it will open, I believe, a side window on your screen. And down on the bottom right of your side window on your screen, you will see an option to raise your hand. Now, you don't need to do this now, but when we get to the Q&A section of today, that will be helpful for raising your hand to let me know that you have a question you want to ask. It will show up on my screen that your hand has gone up, and I will unmute you so you can ask your question. There is an option for the chat. For those of you who don't know already, there you can click on the chat window, and you can also ask questions through typed format there, or you can say where you're from or communicate with some of the other members on the call. That is all you need to know for now about this Zoom system. It's a pretty remarkable platform, and I enjoy using it. I like being able to see people's faces when we're talking about people power and nonviolent struggle. So that concludes our brief technical orientation. And now I'd like to get into the substance of what we're going to talk about today. This particular seminar is designed to be kind of an overview of nonviolent struggle. Oftentimes we participate in actions in our communities, or we know a few stories about nonviolent struggle, including Gandhi or the civil rights movement. But there is an art and a science behind how nonviolent struggle works, and I'd like to present some of the dynamics of that today. I'll be using a bit of a slideshow for one part of it, and then I'll open up for questions before we go into the second half of the program. And then we'll have a longer Q&A at the end of today's session. So just to begin in brief, nonviolent action has a lot of names. It's known as nonviolence, nonviolent struggle, civil resistance, people power, satyagraha. There are a number of different words that we use, even within English, to describe what is a set of tools and a accompanying set of philosophies and theories of change that is being used by people around the world to organize movements for a wide variety of social justice issues. Nonviolent action has been used in almost, if not every, country in the world. I hesitate to make a blanket statement about every country, but I also think that some of the forms of nonviolent action are so natural to humanity that it is almost impossible to imagine that we have not used them somewhere in the world. from the field of research, we know that nonviolent action is used by people of every race, gender, faith, political, sexual orientation, background, ages, just all kinds of people have used nonviolent struggle successfully to achieve the goals that they are looking to achieve in their communities, in their nations. And we know now that when we look at specific types of nonviolent struggles, specifically the three that have been researched are changing a governmental regime, expelling foreign invasions, and ending occupations, we now know that nonviolent struggle is showing itself to be twice as successful as violent means of waging the same types of struggle. Now that's really crucial. This is the work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stephan, who are two researchers who compared violent and nonviolent campaigns for the first time using empirical data. So not anecdotes or stories, but actually looking at 323 case studies from around the world. So we know nonviolent struggle works, and the pertinent question for us who are potentially interested in using it in our lives in our community is, how does it work? What makes it work? And how can we use this knowledge to achieve the goals that we might be seeking to achieve? So the title of today's program is Oppose and Propose. And one of the things that I'd like to bring up again and again today is the idea that there are really two hands of nonviolence. Now, Barbara Deming, who was a nonviolent theorist, practitioner, organizer, and a feminist, formulated the two hands of nonviolence as, I will stand up to your injustice and I will stop the destruction that you are causing. But at the same time, I will hold out my hand of reconciliation, of respect, of our shared human dignity, with a solution or a new path forward that you and I, even though we disagree on this issue, can find a way forward together. In a broader context, the two hands of nonviolence can also refer to opposing injustice and proposing a solution, stopping harm and destruction and injustice, and building the new systems we wish to see in the world. Gandhi framed this as Constructive Program, which we'll talk a lot about later on. And Michael Nagler, a Gandhian nonviolent scholar here in the United States, posed the other hand as being called Obstructive Program. So the obstructive stops and the constructive builds. One of the reasons that I feel that these two modalities are so important to understand in the context of nonviolent struggle is because our understanding of how change happens has grown and developed over the years. And I'm going to do a little screen share now, and thank you for bearing with a slideshow, but to talk a little bit about power and struggle so that we can understand how change occurs. Let me just enter this. So what you're seeing on the screen are just some of the many, many struggles that have occurred. You'll see the civil rights movement in many of the frames. You'll see researchers such as Erica Chenoweth, Thich Nhat Hanh, People Power Revolution, the SOA Watch. The stories go on and on. Just wanted to give you some images to frame the context of what we're talking about in a theoretical sense, because all nonviolent theory becomes real life people on the ground. One thing to think about as we're talking today is that while we often are experienced with participating in actions, we don't always understand that actions make up campaigns, which serve as the building blocks of the arc of a movement. So nonviolent struggle is about more than a single action, a single march, a single demonstration. It's potentially and theoretically about more than just a single campaign for a limited goal. If we look at the civil rights movement, for example, these are just two campaigns listed in this chart. The civil rights movement included numerous campaigns, including the Nashville, Tennessee sit-ins, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Mississippi Freedom Summer, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and the list goes on and on. Within each of these campaigns, a variety of actions were used, and we will talk more about the different types of nonviolent action in just a moment. But the basic concept that I want you to keep in mind is that actions make up campaigns, and those campaigns become the building blocks to achieving the broader goals of the movement. For example, the Nashville sit-ins used tactics of sit-ins, pickets, boycotts, marches to desegregate the lunch counters of Nashville, Tennessee, and to allow Black people to have access to formerly white-only spaces. Once Nashville desegregated their downtown lunch counters, the next campaign that built upon that success was to desegregate the stores that were not in the downtown area and the movie theaters. Simultaneously, the civil rights movement coordinated a series of other campaigns to desegregate lunch counters in I believe it was 6 other cities throughout the US following the success of the Nashville campaign. So when thinking strategically, we're always trying to build upon the successes to achieve broader goals of the movement. Now, I'm going to come back to this point that I was making about our theory of change. In the old days, we used to think that power came from the top. It was God-given only. The kings had it. When the king said jump, everybody jumped. What the scholar Gene Sharp posited was that power actually doesn't work this way. That power holders such as kings, dictators, CEOs of corporations, the list can actually go on. Power holders have their power because people cooperate with the regime or the corporation or the government and provide a series of required resources to that regime or power holder, without which the power holder would not have the ability to actually give an order and have it get done. So effective power comes only through the consent of the governed. And it may actually need a little adjective like the unwilling consent of the governed or the frightened consent of the governed. Now, I want to take a look a little bit about what these pillars of support they're called, the things that prop up the regime, hold the power holder in their power position. I want to look a little bit about what those are just briefly. We could do a whole seminar on this, but in brief, a power holder needs a wide variety of resources. They need authority, people to respect them. They need human resources, the people to actually do the tasks that they want. They need skills and knowledge provided to them. So if you are the CEO of a corporation that wants to drill and frack for oil or gas, you need scientists, you need geologists, you need knowledge of where the oil is, you need knowledge of the terrain, you need knowledge of the science behind what you're doing. Otherwise, you can't actually accomplish that task. They also need material resources such as nuts and bolts and pipelines in the case of the oil and gas company. They need money, is considered a material resource. They need intangible factors, things such as the obedience of a population or the belief that obedience is correct, the correct behavior. Fear is often an intangible factor that power holders rely on to achieve their goals. So there's a wide variety of those. And then sanctions, the last category that Gene Sharp identified, is the ability to punish a population if they do not comply with the power holder's demands. And this might be physical violence, it might be seizure of assets such as bank accounts or houses, or the ability to fire workers, for example. And the agents that carry out these sanctions may be lawyers, they may be, in the case of physical violence, they may be not just police or military, they may also be hired thugs or gangs to achieve that. All right, so this is a modified screen of just showing that when you erode, weaken, break, remove, or transform these pillars, the power holder literally cannot stay in their power position. They will fall from power. And the field of civil resistance has actually demonstrated this many times over the years, that if you can erode those pillars of support, the power holder will fall from position, or the regime, or the government, or the company. Now, the goal of a movement may not be to totally kick a power holder out of power, but rather to put them in a position where they concede to the changing the situation of injustice. We're going to talk about that in a minute. This is a complex image, I know, to spend some time with it. These are the pillars of support turned on their side. And the reason I do this is because I believe that the situation of a problem does not arise in a vacuum, that problems and solutions go hand in hand as dual systems in our world. So the resources of our society, our human resources, our resources in terms of materials, all of those factors we just mentioned, can either go to propping up the problem that we see in the world, or they can go to building and supporting the solution that we wish to see in the world. And nonviolent action, as a set of tools and tactics, offers us a number of ways to start to change the equation of where those resources are going. So in this diagram, we are looking at several different types of nonviolent action. Now, there are over 198 different methods, types of actions of nonviolent action, cataloged by Gene Sharp. They all work in different ways to change the equation of where society's support and resources are going. So acts of protest and persuasion, things like marches, demonstrations, signs, symbols, banners, those sway hearts and minds. They convince people to give their ideological or mental support to a problem or to a solution. And the goal of using acts of protest and persuasion is to change those hearts and minds and get them to withdraw cooperation and consent from the problem and put it, ideally, into the solution. Now, those alone are not always enough to change the situation. Sometimes we need acts of non-cooperation, where we're actually removing our tangible support from the problem. These may look like things such as boycotts, or strikes, or stay home sicks, or refusal of services. The list of types of non-cooperation go on quite a ways. I'll share a resource in the chat box later that has all those 198 methods. Non-cooperation is important because, as you can see in the diagram on the screen, it takes a resource that we are holding and currently giving to a problem, and it says, no, you're not going to get this anymore. You're not going to get our money if you're going to continue this injustice. Or you're not going to get our time or our skills or our labor if you're going to continue this injustice. Sometimes that's not enough. And you need to do acts of intervention. These types of nonviolent action are often things like blockades, shutdowns, acts of disruption that intervene in the functioning of a system or a meeting, an operation. They can be occupations as well. I am seeing a lot of chats in the chat box, and I can't actually respond to them at this moment, but I will get to them in a moment. So I just want to let you know that I see those. Acts of intervention are important as well because they also stop the flow of resources to the problem that we're facing. But now, all of this alone is that one hand of nonviolence. It's saying stop the problem. But we have other hands of nonviolence: constructive program, building new systems, and reconciliation that help move the problem, the people participating in the problem, ourselves and our communities, into a new system or a solution. So all of these together become a very fluid and very powerful system of change. And I want to just pause for a moment here because this has been a lot of information. And I want us to be able to just take a breath and absorb that, maybe catch up at our notes. I'm going to check the chat box, and then we're going to have a moment for any questions that are arising in this moment. And then I'm going to go on and talk about constructive programs specifically. Thank you, Eric, for sharing that link. That's one of the ones I was going to share. And, okay. I see a question from Catherine about acts of destruction and whether or not they're nonviolent. I'm going to answer that question from my perspective. There's a lot of views on this. But while I'm doing that, I want to open up the first of our 2 Q&A sessions. So there are 2 ways that you could do this. Using the participants tab, you can get your side window to pop up your hand raising, and you can raise your hand to ask a question. The other way is you can put your question into the chat box, and we can answer it that way. Okay. So, acts of destruction. There are a number of ways of framing that. Generally, acts of, let's see, I'm going to answer it this way. At Campaign Nonviolence, we talk about violence and nonviolence not as a black and white equation, but rather a spectrum of violence to nonviolence. On the spectrum, we have things that are all the way from physical acts of violence to structural and systemic violence, things like racism, inequality, economic injustice, sexism, discrimination, acts of destroying one's own property, acts of sabotage of property. Then you get into kind of the nonviolent side of it, where you're using nonviolent action, nonviolence towards ourselves and others, non-harming in a deep spiritual sense. I mean, the Jains of India wear masks over their faces to not swallow flies. There are people who won't do boycotts because they see it as causing the harm of economic violence to a corporation. So one way to start this discussion is that violence and nonviolence are not black and white, but rather they occur on a spectrum. And we don't have all the answers, any of us, as to where something falls on that spectrum. Now, Gene Sharp, on his list of 198 methods of nonviolent action, includes destruction of one's own property as a nonviolent action, but not the destruction of property of others. Now, one of the ways that I approach this conversation, because I see sabotage as falling in this gray zone for a lot of people, and they start to weigh, is the sabotage of an oil pipeline less than the violence of the oil pipeline to the environment and the potential, extinction of humanity? That kind of discussion isn't necessarily the question that we really need to be asking, which may be more about what are the effects of this action going to be on the success or the failure of achieving our stated goals, of protecting the environment, of stopping the oil pipeline, all of this stuff. So in the US, and this may be different from country to country, what we have found over and over again is destruction of property tends to backfire upon movements and move them away from achieving their goals. Generally because, unfortunately, I'm going to be very realistic, property is held more sacred than people. And so the dynamics around property destruction usually means that it's alienating for the movement, and it pushes people away from supporting the movement, both in the power holding class, also in terms of bystanders. So it's a long discussion. My general advice is to avoid acts of destruction if you are within the context of a nonviolent movement. That's the short answer to the long answer. Eric wants to know about the legal aspects of nonviolent protest. You're attending a march this weekend. So that is well beyond the scope of what I can address in this workshop, Eric. And there are a number of trainings that are happening. I'm not sure if you're in the DC march or somewhere else in the country, but a lot of the major cities, the marches are coming along with direct action training or nonviolence and active bystander trainings beforehand. And that is where they can give you very specific advice around the type of action that you're about to engage in. Are there any questions from people? I'm going to scan and see if there are any hands up right now about what we've been talking about in terms of obstructive program, the overall arcs of movements, the pillars of support. Great. Well, now you know where your hand raising button is, and you know where your chat window is. So if you have a question, you can ask it. I'd like to go into the other side of nonviolence, the constructive program. Now, this is a term that was crafted by Gandhi, created by Gandhi. He coined it in both English and his comparable word in his own language, which I am sorry to say I'm totally blanking on right now. It'll come back. And he viewed that if we want to look at the proportion of which hand to use in the course of making change, it should be 80% constructive action and 20% obstructive action. His maybe rule of thumb was be constructive whenever possible and obstructive only when necessary. Now, a constructive program is a particular type of action that occurs within the context of a movement for social change. It is not just a positive project in the world. Those are great. I love those. Those should be going on en masse all the time. But what makes Constructive Program is that it occurs within the context of a nonviolent movement trying to achieve particular goals. So there are a few other caveats to what makes a constructive program a constructive program. Gandhi, just as a disclaimer, we'll talk a little bit about the SALT campaign later on. And the spinning wheel, of course, is a very well-known constructive program. But he also had, I think, 17 or 18 other constructive programs. He had a whole system of constructive programs for the Indian self-rule movement that was trying to achieve independence from the British colonial government. Now, a constructive program needs to be something that everyone can do. It is not something that only specialists can do. It's something that everyone in your movement and your society can actually physically do. So that's two qualifications. One, everybody can do it. And two, it's something you physically or tangibly do. So oftentimes people think about constructive program and they're thinking about symbolic things. So everybody wearing a certain color or, the idea of a certain imagery in our society. Constructive programs can have a very strong symbolic element, but they need to be tangible. And here is why. For a constructive program to be an effective part of a movement for change, it needs to do these two things. It needs to decrease the reliance of the movement or the society on the oppressor or the problematic power holder. And simultaneously, it needs to increase the self-reliance of the movement and the society. So let's look at Gandhi's cloth campaign, spinning campaign specifically. So when Gandhi initiated the spinning campaign, they had a problem. The Indians were buying their cloth for their clothing from the British import shops in India. So they were buying British cloth. Meanwhile, the Indian spinners and cloth weavers were starving, literally, in some of their villages. So here was the Indian self-rule movement. They were wearing British cloth. They were paying money to the British Empire to the tune of, I believe it was 10 to 20% of the British colonial revenue stream. When they start to spin their own yarn and they make their own cloth, there's a symbolic element to that, right? So suddenly everyone's actually wearing cloth that says, I support the Indian self-rule movement. But they also decrease their reliance on the British imports and the British colonial government, while increasing the revenue stream into Indian villages, Indian spinners, and in a specific part of it to the Indian self-rule movement specifically. This dynamic becomes very powerful. I forget the exact numbers on the spinning campaign, but we'll talk about the SALT campaign, which knocked out 80% of the entire revenue that the British Empire was taking from salt. which was, I believe, 8% of their overall colonial revenue. So, what I would like to say next about that, I'm sorry, I had to deal with a little technical thing, is that another qualification of constructive program, or I should say it's not a qualification so much as an aspect to consider if you're looking for a constructive program or a set of them for a project or campaign you are working on, is that they are often not directly confrontational. They are often something that is considered a stealth issue or something that is overlooked by your opposition group. Famously, when Gandhi announced the SALT campaign, the British Empire said, or the British agent said, "I will not lose any sleep over SALT." And the joke goes, he didn't lose any sleep, but he lost India. So everyone overlooked the potential of the SALT campaign. But in reality, it was actually a keystone issue. So a keystone is the triangular wedge in an arch, and it holds up the entire structure of the arch. So if you remove that keystone issue, the arch crumbles. When you can find and identify these keystone issues for your campaigns and movements, that becomes really powerful. It means that your constructive program, if adopted by many, many people, has a huge revolutionary potential that is being overlooked by the empire, by the oppressor, by the CEO of the company, by the problem that's in your society. So does that make sense to everyone? Those are the basic concepts of constructive program. And it's, it's in a long list, but it's a significant list. And I want to just return for a moment to one of the slides so that we can look at it again. I hope you can all see that. So if this is the slide of the pillars and the many types of actions and the way they all interact together. Over on the side, you can see where they're building new systems. Now, remember I mentioned that just building a new system is not necessarily a constructive program. It's a really good thing to be happening in the world. But a constructive program, as you can see the little figure next to the words constructive program, a constructive program literally takes the resources that are currently going to the problem in your society and moves them over to the new system. It literally deconstructs the old and reconstructs or constructs the new. And in combination with all the other types of nonviolent action, these two forces, the obstructive and the constructive, can combine into an almost unstoppable force. Now, part of what makes constructive programs so effective is that different parts of your populace will engage with constructive program differently. So if we look at Gandhi's SALT campaign, he had a number of campaigns for the Indian self-rule movement leading up to the SALT campaign. And the people who were generally involved with this tended to be of a certain background. Namely, they were a lot of men who could get arrested But when Gandhi started doing the salt and the spinning campaign, a new group of people joined the self-rule movement actively. And that was the women of India, in huge numbers, in ways that he had never tapped into before. Because these were things that were practical, tangible. They were not necessarily putting your body out in front of getting beaten up by the police. They were the spinning. The spinning was a non-arrestable activity. They could not get arrested for spinning. Making salt was actually an arrestable activity. And we'll get into those dynamics in a moment. So I am going to pause here and open up again for questions specifically about Constructive Program. It also gives me a chance to take a breath, and that's a good thing. Breathing is always good. David Johnston, thank you for sharing that link about this project, Planet Earth Singles. I'm just reading Mirella's note. In the US, we need to build green mass transportation, removing oil from the center. Yes. Now, to look at the Montgomery bus boycott just for a moment, the bus boycott, a boycott is an obstructive action. However, the rideshare and the carpool organization that they sustained for the 9 months of the campaign was a constructive program. It involved people working together to make a replacement system for the buses they could not use. Now, that was a temporary constructive program for the duration of the bus boycott. In the situation Mirella is bringing up, we could also think about what are the constructive ways to address the fact that all of our transportation, or most of our transportation in the US, is actually fossil fuel based. How do we reduce that? Through ride shares, through carpooling, through encouraging bicycling for those who are able, for actually promoting the non-fossil fuel based forms of transportation. In the Pacific Northwest right now, the Backbone campaign is advocating something they call solutionary rail, which is about both electric rails and also creating freight rail transportation for sustainable businesses, not just for what we call the oil bomb trains, the oil trains that are literally carrying highly explosive loads of oil across the country right now. So those are some examples. Some other examples of constructive program, it would be restorative justice in the context of particularly, I'm thinking Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black Lives, which is using restorative justice as an intervention in racist punitive justice systems that are causing great harm and destruction to their communities. Also as a constructive program of combating or transforming, intervening in the mass incarceration system in the United States. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to try something here. There we go. Okay. Thank you, Nina. What a great comment she just put out. She says, civilian peacekeeping is constructive too. Yes, absolutely. as is civilian-based defense in the context of replacing militarism or over-militarized ways of defending nations. So for those who don't know, civilian peacekeeping or unarmed peacekeeping is a set of practices for using nonviolent tools and tactics for establishing peace, de-escalating violent conflict, and helping to create security, stability, and safety in regions where violence is occurring or likely to occur. This happens both internationally with international unarmed peacekeeping teams such as Nonviolent Peace Force or UPC, but it also in the US is happening domestically in terms of groups like Ceasefire Chicago, which are former gang members who are using these skills to interrupt violence before or as it's breaking out in the streets of Chicago. There are a number of groups like this throughout the US that are doing violence intervention in that context. And that is a constructive program to a number of issues, including poverty, racism, gang violence, or the problems of violent gang tensions in neighborhoods. Also, again, it's a way of preventing conflicts from reaching a punitive justice system that is destroying communities here in the US. So there's a number of different frameworks for that. Good ideas, everyone. All right, so in the last segment of what I'd like to discuss today on this webinar in Oppose and Propose is to go a step further in talking about combining the obstructive and the constructive programs. Because if we're going to tap into this powerful force for change, then we need to know a little bit about the dynamics of how it works together. And one of the easiest ways to describe this is to tell the story of Gandhi's Salt Satyagraha, or the Salt Campaign. So we've mentioned this a little bit, but I'm going to tell it from the beginning, because you're going to see, and I'll emphasize this along the way, the obstructive and the constructive working together. So in 1930, or just prior to 1930 in India, Gandhi and the self-rule movement were, and the Indian National Congress had actually tasked Gandhi and the self-rule movement to come up with a new campaign, something they could do to undermine and weaken the British Empire's colonial control of India. So Gandhi went and thought about this for quite some time, and he comes back to them and he says, salt. We need to disobey the odious salt laws. Now, everyone in the Indian National Congress groaned and said, oh my God, Gandhi, you've lost it. Salt. Who cares about salt? And Gandhi said, the ordinary, everyday, average Indian citizen cares about salt. Because salt is a necessity of life in India. It is a preservative in a tropical climate, and it's used to preserve foods. Now, formerly to British colonial control, Indians made salt. They made salt, they sold salt, they traded salt, they controlled their own salt works. When the British colonial government had actually created a monopoly on salt, saying that only the specific salt works that were owned and operated by the British had license to make and sell salt. So everyone in India suddenly had to pay the British rates for salts, which they had been recently raising the rates, and everyone was annoyed at the fact that they had to pay this. So Gandhi decides, we're going to disobey the salt laws. We're going to make salt. and he starts to use nonviolent action. Namely, he writes some letters about how he's going to break the salt laws and why everyone else should do civil disobedience to the British monopoly on salt. And then he announces, I'm going to march to the sea to make salt. Marching is another form of nonviolent action. And he invites the press, please come to the ashram, we're setting out on such and such a day. Now, along the march route, he stops at dozens and dozens of villages. And in the villages, he gives talks, lectures, speeches, they have rallies, they have organizing meetings, and they have trainings. All of these things are part of Obstructive Program. A lot of those are acts of protest and persuasion, preparation for doing other action. They continue to write letters and to publish articles, also acts of protest and persuasion, and they continue to march, which is a symbolic act. Now, as Gandhi's going, the rumor starts building, he's going to break the salt laws, he's going to break the salt laws. And he gets to the sea, and he reaches down into this fistful of mud and salt water, and he picks it up, and in that fistful of mud and salt water, he has broken the salt laws. And that is an individual act of non-cooperation with an unjust law. When 60,000 Indians who have gathered with him at the sea join him in picking up that fistful of mud and salt, and then bring the salt water over and start to boil out the water to collect the salt, making salt, that becomes an act of mass non-cooperation with an unjust law, mass civil disobedience. What this does is it makes the salt laws essentially unenforceable by the British. So he has combined in a single action the constructive action of making the salt and the obstructive action of civil disobedience. But the story gets better. This is why I love this story. Because, once that starts going on at the beach, the British Empire gets a little upset. So the British Empire arrests Gandhi, finally. Everyone had been wondering when it was going to happen. But arresting Gandhi doesn't stop the salt campaign. In fact, thousands more people are also arrested for making salt. But now the Indian self-rule movement is not only making salt, they're selling it in all the cities. So the British colonial government starts to arrest all those people. But now it's becoming this symbolic thing where to defy the British Empire is to make salt. So remember, the women are getting involved now. They're literally taking fistfuls of salt, sticking their hand out the window as the British colonial government goes by and shouting, "Down with the British Empire." Indian self-rule in ways that they had never been participant before. Now the British colonial government can't have this. So they start to pass all kinds of laws to keep the Indian population out of the streets. So curfew laws, anti-assembly laws, laws against certain types of speech in public places. And Gandhi's word to the movement is every time they pass a new law, go out en masse and break it. So they start to arrest more and more people until the jails are full. They have overloaded the facility, which is another form of nonviolent action, of the jails. And every time this happens, British authority is undermined more and more and more and more. Remember, authority is one of those pillars of support. Now, they're not just undermining authority, they're also they're lessening their dependency on the British salt, and they're increasing their self-reliance as a movement because they're making their own salt. But they're also taking away 8% of the British colonial government's revenue, their money that was coming from the salt. And this starts to hit home. So there are other campaigns as part of the salt campaign, or other actions as part of the salt campaign. One of them is famously the raid upon the Darsana salt works, in which they nonviolently raid and try to occupy the salt works. This does not actually go successfully in terms of occupying the salt works, but what does occur is that the international press is alerted and a whole different level of pressure is put upon this colonial government. In the end, the salt campaign succeeds in getting the salt laws revoked, although there's several stages to that. And what it ultimately does is it becomes a game changer in terms of the Indian population's willingness to defy the British Empire and willingness to take action to show their independence, to rule themselves, to create their own salt. The cloth campaign, the spinning campaign, also has an uptick and an upswing as it becomes seen how the obstructive and the constructive work together as an unstoppable force. So the SALT campaign is a very powerful story for us to reflect on, like what made it work? What were the elements that really helped that succeed? Planning, preparation, strategy, media, acts of protest and persuasion, which are very visible generally, and help to move people into action. This use of a constructive program that everyone could do, that even if you couldn't get arrested, you could make salt. Even if you couldn't go raid the salt works, you could go buy from the agent of the self-rule movement, a little package of salt that day. So this is how these two things go together so well, hand in hand. And if we look around at contemporary movements, we often struggle to identify and implement constructive programs, but they can be very powerful. One other story that I'll tell very briefly is that in the civil rights movement, the effort in Mississippi to establish voting rights for African Americans was stalling. It was not working. And one of the major reasons was because anyone who put their name down on a piece of paper as wanting to vote was getting terrorized and lynched by the white population. And then there were a series of laws that were in place to intimidate African Americans from registering to vote, including laws about literacy, needing to be able to read to a certain level. And so Fannie Lou Hamer, specifically, and the Mississippi Freedom Summer team launched a constructive program that preceded a renewed effort to register African Americans to vote in Mississippi. During the Mississippi Freedom Summer, people came together to literally build schools because there were not schools for Black children in that era in many of the rural regions of Mississippi. So rather than getting people to vote, they got people to bring nails, boards, wood, to show up and hammer to put the school together. Then they got people together inside the school to learn to read and write, to learn their rights, to learn the confidence that comes from solidarity, so that later when they were going to go down and face intimidation, repression, violence, extreme danger to actually register to vote, they had that constructive base from which to work. And in that case, in that instance, the voting campaign could not have succeeded without the earlier constructive work of building the schools and the educational work of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. So I am going to pause there again for questions and turn it back to you. We have about 15 minutes left on our webinar, and I'd like to let you guys ask questions. We wanted to make sure that we made time for your questions at the end. This has been a very broad overview of nonviolent struggle, but one of the reasons I try to always present this is because we rarely get it. This may not be true in other countries, but my experience in the US, traveling around to communities all over the country, is that we are missing this particular nugget of understanding nonviolent struggle. So I do try to prioritize it in terms of what we're teaching and educating, or what I particularly am teaching and educating. All right, we got some questions coming on in. Nina, I do not think, I think people are aware a little bit of the march from Berlin to Aleppo. And maybe you could take a moment and actually just mention that briefly to people if you feel like your internet is stable enough. I'm going to unmute you now. Oh, you're trying to find the link. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, I was just looking at it, but then if I try to do two things at the same time, I'm cut out. Briefly, that they are now in the Czech Republic, and it is an initiative to like all the refugees are marching, or are walking, not marching, of course, from Aleppo to Europe. To start walking as kind of a response against all the maybe, well, xenophobic, or at least all the fear responses from many people in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. So yes, I will find the link and you can read about it. It was recently on Waging Nonviolence website also.
Great. Thank you for mentioning that, Nina.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, questions coming in the chat box. Excellent. Let's see. Daryl asked about the general effect of property destruction in a nonviolent movement, and he is thinking generally about violent flanks. We talked about that a little earlier, so just in brief, I want to mention that there is a sentiment that persists that a nonviolent movement needs a violent flank to ensure its success, or that a violent flank to a nonviolent movement contributes to the success of a nonviolent movement. Namely, that the oppressor or the power holder fears the violent flank and so concedes to the nonviolent movement's demands. This seems to have some logic. However, it has been demonstrated to actually not be true. That in case studies, when we look at them, the presence of a violent flank is actually reducing the likelihood of success of a nonviolent movement. And this is due to a couple of dynamics that we haven't spoken about much on this webinar. One is that the most important dynamic to understand about nonviolent movements is that mass participation is key. The numbers matter. Particularly any movement that has successfully mobilized 3.5% of its populace hasn't always won. And movements with much smaller amounts have also won their goals. But what matters is that we get many, many people taking action together. Violence in a movement, a nonviolent movement, tends to lower the participation rate of that movement, which then actually lowers its likelihood of success. We should perhaps present a whole webinar on this at some point, but property destruction, again, of other people's property, tends to have a similar effect on the participation rates of a nonviolent movement, or the general favorability of public sentiment towards the primarily nonviolent movement. Wow, great questions. So I'm going to try to address many of these as we go on. Darcy asked me to explain the reconciliation portion of the diagram of pillars of support and the problems and solutions. So at the bottom of the image, there's a little figure holding out the hand of reconciliation. Reconciliation is not always a part of all systems of nonviolent change. However, it is a central part of the Kingian nonviolent philosophy of change, as well as many others, but that one comes to mind specifically. Reconciliation takes a lot of forms throughout the world, but let me just comment specifically on the general concept of reaching out the hand of reconciliation to your opposition group. One, if you do this within the context of your movement, it is always an open door for your opposition group to walk through towards the movement. If you slam shut the door of reconciliation to your opposition group, it's pretty guaranteed they're not going to walk through that solid door. So you always want to have the option for the unlikely event that your oppressor group or your opposition group will actually change their position and join you. There's another reason that this is important, and we learned about this in the field of civil resistance in the context of extremely repressive dictatorships. When you slam shut the outs, the way of a dictator or a power holder to get out of their situation, and it seems to them that they have only extremely negative consequences for relinquishing power, such as your dictator's head will be paraded around the streets on a pole. The dictator then generally uses extreme repression because they're backed into a corner. Whereas when the movement is able to say, we will not allow you to remain in power, but we will give you the option of leaving the country and seeking asylum elsewhere, it becomes more likely that the dictator in that situation will take the choice to leave and not use the same amounts of violent repression. Now, in other contexts, let's look at the civil rights movement. The white people and the black people aren't going anywhere. They're not leaving the country. We're not going to lock up all the white supremacists in the United States, however tempting that idea might be. We have to reconcile ultimately. We have to find ways to live together. And the more that a movement, while confronting injustice, can reach out the hand of reconciliation, the more the process and pathway towards healing and actually living together can occur. And this can become very productive, very useful within the context of your movement. So Darcy, that's a brief answer to your question. Again, it would be great to have a whole webinar on this. Wow, you guys are great. Thank you, Nina, for those links. And I'm going to go to the next question, which is about the confidence that comes with solidarity. Great question, Anna. So oftentimes, some of those intangible factors that are holding injustice or oppression or power holder in place, a few of those intangible factors are isolation, separation, fear, the assessment that to take action will have dire consequences for you as an individual. So if a movement wants to transform that intangible factor, that pillar of support, and switch it into something that's beneficial for a movement, building connection, cooperation, solidarity, the feeling that together we are strong, where before we were weak and vulnerable as isolated individuals. The confidence of solidarity often comes through education, understanding how nonviolent struggle works, understanding that change is possible or there is a realistic path to change. And these are sometimes very foundational for getting people to take action, to have the courage to take action if they are facing repression or if they have a lot to lose. Sometimes repression is not physical violence, but a position at work or a social standing in a community. There are a number of considerations like that, and that confidence of solidarity can help shift and transform people's willingness to take part in a movement. Thank you for those FYI actions in the comments. Really good to know about those. All right, Joy, you asked about the plowshare activists in the United States. So just context for those who don't know, in the anti-nuclear movement in the United States, there have been hundreds of plowshare actions. It's a group called Plowshares. And many of them have involved dismantling or destroying parts of the nuclear weapon systems, things from the computers that were slated to run the systems to actually hammering on warheads. There have been a number of variations. Again, it's in that gray zone. And you know, I have a lot of friends who are actually plowshare activists. And so I don't have a cut and dry answer for you about where it falls on the spectrum of nonviolence or violence, because there's actually a number of different types of plowshare actions. What we can note is what has been the effect of each action, public sentiment, the reactions of people. Has each action contributed to the willingness of the population to actually end the nuclear weapons program? How effective have those tactics been versus other tactics that could be used? And again, there's no judgment in what I'm saying. These are the questions that I ask around choices of tactics. So yeah, we should talk about that. We could have a nice long conversation. Okay. Great comment from Catherine about the Women's March. You guys are having a great chat there. I appreciate it. All right, so we are at the top of the hour, and I don't seem to be able to post links in the chat for you guys. So let me see if I can just, there we go. Okay. I wanted to share that winter webinar series information and also the donation link again. Colleen asked if this can be recorded. It is recorded, and we should be posting it on YouTube and sending you all the links specifically, but we'll also circulate it broadly later on this week. I can't promise to do it today. Do take a moment and share any things that really stood out for you about what was useful in this workshop or webinar in the links, and any comments you might wish to send to us. We do appreciate those. And I want to just especially thank Nina and Svag and Towards a Nonviolent World for initiating these conversations and for opening up the webinars to everyone for free or by donation if possible. And just thank you for taking time on your Wednesday morning to join us to have this conversation and to learn about these subjects. There's a lot more to learn, and I hope you will continue your journey in knowing about this. If you do have specific thoughts on workshops or webinars you would like us to present in the future, please let us know about those, because we do listen to your feedback. Thank you, everyone. And I am going to unmute all of you so you can say goodbye to everyone as you're leaving. Oh, to leave, there's a leave this meeting button on your bottom right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, everybody. It was great.
Love you, Rivera.
Goodbye.
Bye all. Thank you so
Bye,
much. Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye, everybody.
Bye.